Good evening, and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in, pull the blanket close, breathe in the warmth of the room, and let your thoughts slow. Tonight, we'll travel far back in time to the edge of a new world, when gratitude was not yet a holiday, but a hard-won act of survival. And as you listen, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Share it down in the comments. Our little circle of light spans continents and time zones, joined by the same curiosity that brought people together centuries ago. And of course, if you'd like more journeys into the hidden corners of Lullaby Historian, be sure to subscribe. Each story opens a window into how we came to celebrate and why we remember. Now close your eyes if you'd like and visualize the architectural solitude of Neuschwanstein Castle. The Moon King's Dream. The architectural solitude of Neuschwanstein. The Cradle of Clouds. Ludwig's childhood at Hohenschwangau and the early rhythm of Alpine rain. Long before the limestone peaks of the Bavarian Alps were crowned with the soaring white turrets of Neuschwanstein, the world of the young Prince Ludwig II was contained within the warm, amber-hued walls of Schloss Hohenschwangau. To understand the grand, solitary silence of the man who would become the Moon King, one must first descend into the humid, sensory-rich atmosphere of his childhood sanctuary. This was not a palace of statecraft or cold marble, but a fortress of the imagination, nestled deeply into the rugged folds of the mountains, where the air was forever saturated with the scent of damp pine and the mineral breath of the high crags. The percussion of the Alpine rain. The most fundamental rhythm of Ludwig's early life was the Alpine rain. In the high country of Bavaria, the rain is not merely weather, it is a sustained texture of existence. It would begin as a soft gray veil drifting over the soiling mountain, a silent erasure of the horizon that made the world feel small and intimate. Then the sound would arrive, a steady, hypnotic pat-tap, pat against the heavy slate tiles of the Hohenschwangau roof. To the young prince, this sound was the primary clock of the universe. While his tutors spoke of the dry laws of the German Confederation and the complex genealogies of the House of Wittelsbach, Ludwig listened to the percussion of the water. The rain created a sanctuary of sound, a rhythmic barrier that separated the castle from the outside world. It muffled the sounds of the village in the valley and the distant clatter of the Munich court. Inside the nursery, the atmosphere was one of permanent twilight. The yellow-painted walls, decorated with frescoes of medieval knights, seemed to glow with a soft internal warmth as the world outside turned a deep, saturated indigo. This rain was the first architect of Ludwig's mind. It taught him the beauty of enclosure. He learned that the most profound thoughts occurred when one was wrapped in a cocoon of stone, protected by a curtain of falling water. The rhythmic drip from the eaves into the stone basins below was a metronome for his growing obsession with the legendary past. It was a boring history of water and stone, a steady, unchanging pulse that promised safety from the frantic pace of the coming century. As he sat by the window, the young prince would watch the raindrops race down the glass, merging and splitting in a chaotic yet rhythmic dance. He found a strange comfort in the predictability of the storm. The mountains, hidden behind the gray curtain, were not gone. They were merely waiting. This taught him patience. He realized that the most beautiful things in the world, the jagged peaks, the deep lakes, the ancient forests, did not need to be seen constantly to exist. They were permanent fixtures of the soul, much like the myths he was beginning to consume. The rain was the veil that kept the world at bay, allowing his inner landscape to grow without the interference of the sun or the demands of other people. The Gallery of the Swan Knight. The interior of Hohenschwangau was a loom of legend. Every room was a chapter from the Middle Ages, rendered in the rich, heavy colors of Romanticism. The young Ludwig did not see these as mere decorations. They saw them as structural truths. He spent hours in the hall of the Swan Knight, where the story of Lohengrin was depicted in flickering candlelight. The atmosphere of these rooms was thick with the scent of beeswax, old wood, and the faint, sweet smell of drying herbs. The floors were made of heavy oak that groaned with a slow, rhythmic creak settle whenever he walked, a sound that felt like the castle itself was breathing. To touch the furniture was to feel the tactile history of the wood, the deep, intricate carvings of vines, mythical beasts, and heraldry that felt like braille for the soul. The swan became the central motif of his quietude. To Ludwig, the swan was the spirit of the lake, a creature of absolute silent grace that moved across the water with a rhythmic fluidity that defied the friction of the world. He watched the real swans on the Alpsee through a brass telescope, their white forms drifting through the gray morning mists like ghosts. He began to equate kingliness not with the loud commands of a general, but with the stately stillness of the swan. This was a quiet, internal education, a slow-motion immersion into a world where beauty was the only law. He would often trace the painted outlines of the knight's armor with his small fingers, feeling the imagined weight of the steel. He wondered about the lives of these men, not their battles, but their solitude. He imagined them keeping vigil in dark chapels, the only sound being the rhythmic flickering of a single candle. He began to see himself as a guardian of these silent stories, a prince whose duty was not to the living, but to the noble dead that inhabited the walls of his home. The education of the heights. As he grew, Ludwig's world expanded from the corridors of the castle to the verticality of the mountains. His walks were not mere exercise, they were ascensions of logic. He followed the winding paths through the pine forests, where the light was filtered through the dense needles into a green gloom. The sound of the forest was a masterpiece of layered silence. There was the low, vibrating drone of the wind through the high boughs, the sudden, rhythmic clatter-thud of a heavy pine cone, and the distant, silver chime of the Polat waterfall. This waterfall, which would one day roar beneath the foundations of Neuschwanstein, was then just a whisper of gravity. In these woods he found his true court. He would sit for hours on the moss-covered rocks, his breathing slowing until it matched the deep tectonic pulse of the mountain. The mountains did not care for the politics of men. They existed in a state of eternal architecture. This realization planted the first seed of his dream. He did not want to rule people. He wanted to inhabit the silence. The cradle of clouds was a period of internal preparation. As he watched the clouds snag on the jagged peaks above him, he began to envision a castle of air, a place even higher, even silenter, and even more removed from the frantic pulse of the 19th century. He became fascinated by the texture of the limestone. He would run his hands over the rough, cold surface of the boulders, feeling the ancient fossils and the scars left by thousands of years of ice. He understood that stone was the only material that could hold a dream forever. Wood rotted, silk faded, and people died, but stone remained. It was the heavy anchor of reality. During his long climbs, he would often find small caves or overhangs where he could sit and listen to the mountains speak. This speech was a series of low-frequency vibrations, the shifting of the earth, the melting of a glacier, the slow growth of a lichen. To Ludwig, this was the only conversation worth having. The rhythmic solitude of the lake. The Alpsee, the lake that sat at the foot of Hohenschwangau, was the mirror of Ludwig's soul. In the early morning hours, the water was as flat as a sheet of dark glass, reflecting the mountains with a terrifying clarity. Ludwig would often row out into the center of the lake, away from the watchful eyes of his governors and tutors. The sound of the oars, dip, swirl, drip, was the only interruption in the absolute quiet. This was the rhythm of deliberate isolation. On the water, he was the center of a perfect circle. He would watch the mist rise from the surface in long, ghostly fingers, a slow-motion dance of evaporation. The lake taught him about the depth of shadows. He realized that below the beautiful reflection lay a dark, silent world that no one else could see. This became the blueprint for his future life, a bright, beautiful exterior of chivalry with a deep, dark, and silent interior of personal mystery. The Alpsee was his first grotto, a natural cathedral where the only music was the rhythmic lapping of the water against the wooden hull of his boat. It was here that he practiced the art of being alone, a skill that would eventually become his defining characteristic as the Hermit King. He would sometimes stop rowing and simply drift, letting the current take him wherever it willed. In those moments of aqueous drift, he felt a complete dissolution of the self. He was no longer a prince or a son. He was merely a pointed consciousness floating in a vast blue-gray void. The final breath of childhood. As the years of his youth drew to a close, the cradle of clouds began to feel restrictive. The yellow walls of Hohenschwangau, once a sanctuary, now felt like a nursery he had outgrown. The rhythm of the Alpine rain, once a lullaby, now felt like a summons. He began to look higher, toward the Jugend, the ridge where the ruins of two small castles, Vorder Hohenschwangau and Hinter Hohenschwangau, sat like broken teeth against the sky. In his mind, he began to merge those ruins into a single soaring entity. He spent his final nights of childhood in the moonlight vigil, watching the moon rise over the peaks and turn the world into a landscape of silver and ink. The atmosphere was one of expectation. The infinite loom of his life had finished the foundation. It was time to build the towers. The transition from the prince to the king was not a political event, but an architectural necessity. He needed a place where the clouds could be his walls and the silence could be his crown. The cradle of clouds had served its purpose. It had nurtured a soul that could only survive in the heights. As the carriage arrived to take him to Munich, for his coronation, Ludwig looked back at the mist-shrouded towers of Hohenschwangau one last time. The rain was falling again, a steady, rhythmic promise that the mountains would always be there, waiting for him to return and build his dream out of stone. He felt the weight of the future, but he also felt the buoyancy of the dream. He knew that no matter how loud the city became, he carried the marble silence of the Alps within him, a treasure that no crown could ever replace. The heavy crown, the silent, suffocating etiquette of the Munich court, and the longing for the heights. When the crown of Bavaria was placed on the 18-year-old brow of Ludwig II in 1864, it was not felt as a golden achievement, but a leaden descent. The transition from the cradle of clouds in the Alps to the royal residence in Munich was a journey from the infinite to the infinitesimal. To understand the king's eventual flight into the stones of Neuschwanstein, one must first inhabit the acoustic prison of the city, a world defined by the clicking of heels on parquet, the dry rustle of political papers, and the rhythmic, suffocating ticking of 1,000 gilded clocks. This was the boring history of a man who owned a kingdom but was a prisoner to its schedule, a soul that was being slowly crushed by the weight of the gold he wore. The geometry of the court, a labyrinth of velvet. The Munich residence was a masterpiece of rigid symmetry. Unlike the organic, jagged lines of the mountains, the palace was a grid of calculated etiquette. Every morning began with a rhythmic mechanical ritual, the entry of the valets, the precise arrangement of the royal vestments, and the boring history of the morning audience. For the young king, the atmosphere was one of tactile compression. He felt the heavy silk of the royal robes not as a garment, but as a luminous shroud. The sound of the court was a study of artificiality. It was the constant, low-frequency hum of whispers in the corridors, the gossip of the vultures. In the grand ballrooms, the music of the orchestras felt like a distraction from the true silence he had left behind in the heights. He found the rhythmic, synchronized dancing of the aristocrats to be a dance of puppets, a hollow mimicry of life. He would stand at the center of these events, a tall, striking figure with eyes that seemed to be looking through the walls, fixed on a horizon that no one else could see. The crown was heavy, not because of its gold, but because of the metaphorical weight of 1,000,000 expectations. Every nod of his head, every movement of his hand was recorded and analyzed. He was the center of a living museum, where the only law was the preservation of appearance. He longed for the anonymity of the mist, but in Munich, he was the sun around which a cold, calculating solar system rotated. The rhythm of the court was a slow-motion suffocation, a series of repetitive gestures that served no purpose other than the maintenance of a dying tradition. The rhythmic torture of statecraft, the irony of power. Statecraft for Ludwig was an exercise in pointless repetition. He sat in velvet-lined offices where the air was thick with the smell of ink, old parchment, and the cold, metallic scent of the state seal. The sound was the rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch of pens against paper, a sound that felt like it was carving away at his soul. To the ministers, a signature was an act of power. To Ludwig, it was a chain of ink. He found the political landscape of the 1860s, the rising tide of Prussian influence, the mechanical rumble of industrialization, and the cold logic of war to be a discordant noise. He lived in an age that was rapidly becoming horizontal, concerned with borders, railways, and balance sheets. His mind, however, remained vertical. He longed for the heights where the air was too thin for politics. During long cabinet meetings, he would trace the patterns of the marble table, his mind wandering to the marble silence of the Alps. He was a king of the old world, a romantic soul trapped in a century that was learning to measure everything by the pound and the foot. The ministers spoke of progress, but to Ludwig, progress was merely a rhythmic destruction of the beautiful. He saw the iron tracks of the railways as scars on the earth, and the telegram as a rhythm of intrusion. He was a monarch who possessed the power to sign away provinces, but lacked the power to buy a single hour of true, unmonitored peace. The retreat into the night, the birth of the Moon King. As the pressure of the city increased, Ludwig began his famous rhythmic inversion. He realized that the only way to survive the bright noise of the day was to inhabit the silver-gray stillness of the night. He turned the palace into a nocturnal cathedral. While the rest of Munich slept, the king would wake, his footsteps echoing through the empty, candlelit galleries with a slow, deliberate cadence. This was the birth of the Moon King. He found that the night had a different density. The shadows muffle the harsh lines of the city, turning the residence into a dreamscape. He would spend the midnight hours in the royal library, the only sound being the rhythmic turning of pages. He consumed the works of Schiller, the legends of the Grail, and the architectural treatises of the past. The atmosphere was one of intellectual seclusion. In the dark, the crown felt lighter, for there were no eyes to watch him wear it. He began to order his life by the phases of the moon, finding a cosmic rhythm that made the daily schedules of his ministers seem like the buzzing of flies. He would often wander to the rooftop gardens of the residence, looking up at the stars and feeling the cooling touch of the ether. The city below was a grid of sleeping ambitions, but up here he was the master of a silent kingdom. He began to see the night not as an absence of light, but as a presence of truth. The sleigh of shadow and sound, the frozen escape. The most iconic expression of this retreat was the midnight sleigh ride. Ludwig would flee the city for the winter solitude of the mountains, traveling in a gilded, swan-themed sleigh. To describe these journeys is to focus on the rhythm of the winter night. The sound was a hypnotic combination of the rhythmic crunch-glide of the runners over the snow and the constant high-pitched jingle of the silver bells on the horses' harness. The air was sharp and icy, smelling of frozen pine and ozone. Ludwig would sit wrapped in heavy furs, looking up at the crystalline geometry of the stars. In the dark, the mountains looked like giant sleeping statues. This was his true kingdom, a world of black and white, defined by the rhythmic breath of the horses and the flickering orange light of the torches held by his outriders. The sleigh was a moving sanctuary, a vessel that carried him away from the heavy crown and back toward the cradle of clouds. These rides were not just travel, they were rhythmic cleansing, a way to wash the dust of Munich from his spirit. He would travel for hours through the deep blue silence of the Alpine valleys, the only witness to his passing being the occasional startled stag or the frozen rivers that shimmered like silver ribbons in the moonlight. Here he was not King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He was a wanderer of the infinite, a soul that had finally found a pace that matched its own heartbeat. The architecture of loneliness, blueprint for a dream. Throughout this period, the king began to realize that he could not merely inhabit the night, he had to build the night. The residence was a palace for a public king, a man who belonged to the people. Ludwig realized he needed a palace for the private king, a man who belonged only to the moon and the myths. He began to spend his days, or rather his evenings, sketching impossible towers. He wanted a structure that was an extension of the mountain itself, a place where the heavy crown could finally be laid aside. He sought an architecture of loneliness, a space where the geometry of the halls would discourage the presence of others and invite the presence of ghosts. He began to communicate with his architects through letters sent in the middle of the night, his handwriting frantic and weighted with longing. He did not want a fortress for war, he wanted a fortress of beauty. The infinite loom was now pulling the threads of his frustration, his loneliness, and his night vigils to create the first blueprints of a castle that would be a mirror of the soul. The final suffocation, the vow of stone. The movement concludes with a moment of ultimate compression. In 1866, the clouds of war with Prussia gathered, and the political noise in Munich reached a deafening crescendo. Ludwig was forced to engage in the theater of command, a role he found physically repulsive. The ceremonies, the reviews of troops, and the endless meetings were a rhythmic violation of his inner peace. He stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the cheering crowds, and felt an absolute, static emptiness. The crown on his head felt like it was made of the same iron as the cannons. He looked down at the soldiers, their uniforms a rhythm of uniformity, and realized that he could never be the leader they desired. It was at this moment, amidst the loud, frantic pulse of a city at war, that the king made his final silent vow. If the world insisted on being loud, he would build a sanctuary of silence. If the world insisted on being ugly, he would build a cathedral of beauty. The heavy crown had finally crushed the last of his patience, but it had also forged his resolve into something as hard as diamond. The transition from the city of noise to the mountain of stone was now inevitable. The Moon King had decided to leave the earth behind, to climb so high that the voices of men would be nothing more than the distant, rhythmic hum of the wind. Neuschwanstein was no longer a dream, it was his only means of survival. The Wagnerian echo. How the low, rhythmic thrum of opera transformed into the blueprints for a dream. If the cradle of clouds provided the raw material of Ludwig's soul, and the heavy crown provided the desperation for flight, it was the Wagnerian echo that provided the map. To understand the castle of Neuschwanstein, one must realize it was not built of stone alone, but of sound. The architecture was a symphonic translation. The low, vibrating resonance of the cello became the foundation. The soaring, ethereal violins became the slender turrets, and the heroic brass became the golden halls. This was the boring history of an obsession, a decade-long immersion into a world where the laws of physics were replaced by the laws of harmony. The first resonance, the theater of the soul. The transformation began on a rainy night in Munich, 1861, when the young prince attended a performance of Wagner's Lohengrin. To the young prince, this was not a theatrical event, it was a tectonic shift. As the first notes of the overture began, a shimmering, high-frequency vibration of A major, Ludwig felt a rhythmic realignment within his own body. The atmosphere of the opera house was one of saturated emotion. The scent of velvet, perfume, and the faint metallic tang of the gaslights merged with the music to create a sacred void. In the figure of Lohengrin, the Swan Knight, Ludwig found his architectural mirror. Lohengrin arrived from a distance, a hero of absolute silent grace, only to be misunderstood and driven back into the mist. This was the rhythm of tragic solitude. As the curtain fell, Ludwig realized that his life's purpose was to create a physical space that could hold this music forever. He didn't just want to hear the opera, he wanted to inhabit the overture. He began to see the world not in terms of light and shadow, but in terms of resonant frequency. He sought a place where the air itself would vibrate with the myths of the Grail and the legends of the Rhine. The architect of the invisible, the meeting of wills. When Ludwig finally ascended the throne, his first act of power was not a decree of law, but a decree of art. He summoned Wagner to Munich, beginning a relationship that was a binary orbit of genius and obsession. To follow their story is to listen to the rhythm of the dialogue. They spent hours in the music rooms of the residence, the only sound being the soft, percussive thud of piano keys and the frantic rustle of sheet music. Wagner provided the emotional blueprints. He spoke of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, where music, drama, and environment merged into a single overwhelming experience. Ludwig took this literally. If Wagner could build a world out of sound, he would build it out of tactile matter. The atmosphere of their meetings was one of mutual combustion. They were two men trying to weave the infinite loom into a shape that the 19th century could not contain. Ludwig began to see his kingdom as a stage and the mountains of the Alps as the ultimate backdrop. The blueprints for Neuschwanstein were not drawn by traditional architects at first, but by set designers, men like Christian Jank, who understood the rhythm of the visual climax. The translation of the motif, stone as frozen music. The most meticulous part of this boring history was the translation of the leitmotif. In Wagner's music, a leitmotif is a recurring theme that represents a character or an idea. Ludwig demanded that these themes be solidified in his castle. The swan motif of Lohengrin was to be the rhythmic center of the design. He spent countless midnight hours analyzing the geometry of the swan. He wanted the curves of the staircases to mimic the curve of a swan's neck. He wanted the white limestone of the exterior to reflect the pure frequency of the swan's feathers. The atmosphere was one of meticulous precision. He would reject drawings because the rhythm of the windows was too fast or the weight of the pillars was too heavy for the music they meant to represent. He was seeking a symphonic balance in the granite. To Ludwig, a wall was not just a barrier, it was a sheet of vellum onto which the music of the past was being carved. He wanted the castle to sing even when the rooms were empty. The lyrical interior, the hall of the singers. The heart of the Wagnerian dream was the singers' hall. This room was designed to be the resonance chamber of the entire castle. To describe its design is to focus on the texture of sound. The ceiling was made of heavy, dark larch wood, carved with thousands of individual panels to ensure the acoustic warmth of the space. The walls were covered in frescoes depicting the legend of Parzival and the quest for the Holy Grail, a rhythmic progression of images that followed the hero from the forest to the celestial heights.
The atmosphere in the hall was one of anticipation. Even during construction, Ludwig would visit the space at night, standing in the center of the scaffolding, imagining the golden roar of the brass instruments echoing off the timber. The sound of the wind through the high windows provided a natural accompaniment, a low-frequency drone that reminded him that the mountain and the music were one. This hall was his vertical cathedral, a place where the heavy crown of the king would be replaced by the light crown of the poet. He was building a space where time did not move in a straight line, but in a circular harmony, returning always to the mythic origins of the soul. The mechanical harmony, the grotto and the glow. While Ludwig sought the ancient past, he used the rhythmic power of modern technology to achieve it. To create the Venus Grotto, inspired by Wagner's Tannhäuser, he employed the most advanced mechanical systems of the age. This was the birth of technological romanticism. He didn't just want a cave, he wanted a cave that could change colors like a visual symphony. The sound was the constant rhythmic hum of the first large-scale electrical generators in Bavaria. The atmosphere was one of uncanny brilliance. Beneath the castle, the generators pulsed with a metallic heartbeat, powering thousands of light bulbs that turned the stalactites into shimmering ribbons of pink, blue, and gold. Ludwig would sit in a golden boat shaped like a shell, drifting on a mechanical lake, the only witness to this electric myth. This was the discordant truth of his dream. To escape the industrial age, he had to use the very tools of the industry. The labyrinth of his mind was now powered by the spark of the future, creating a static miracle that existed between the centuries. The final echo, the blueprints of flight. The movement concludes with the solidification of the vision. By the late 1860s, the Wagnerian echo had finally settled into a final, unchangeable shape. The blueprints were no longer just paper, they were a command of the will. Ludwig looked at the drawings for the castle, the soaring towers, the jagged outlines that mirrored the peaks, the white stone that looked like a cloud made solid, and he felt a profound, silent completion. The infinite loom had finished the pattern of the music. The boring history of the design was over. The violent history of the construction was about to begin. The king stood on the ridge of the Jugend, looking down into the Perlat Gorge. The sound of the waterfall was no longer just water. It was the rushing strings of the Tannhäuser overture. He was ready to carve the music into the mountain. The Wagnerian echo had given him the courage to turn his back on the city forever. He had found the rhythm of his exit, and it was written in the white stone and the golden halls of his dream. The first stone, the tectonic settling of the foundation on the Perlat Gorge in 1869. By the year 1869, the Wagnerian echo had finally demanded a physical body. The ethereal music and the midnight sketches were no longer enough to contain the king's mounting desperation for a vertical sanctuary. The time had come for the tectonic transition, the moment when the dream would be forced to grapple with the brutal, unyielding reality of Alpine limestone. To understand the building of Neuschwanstein is to set aside the fairytale glitter and embrace the rhythm of the grinding stone. This was a decade of monumental, boring labor, where the only music was the percussive strike of the hammer and the low groaning slide of the winch. The preparation of the precipice, breaking the mountain. The site chosen for the castle, the jagged ridge of the Jugend, was not a place meant for human habitation. It was a geometry of defiance, a narrow spine of rock suspended between the sky and the roaring Perlat waterfall below. The atmosphere of the site in the spring of 1869 was one of shattered stillness. The quietude of the eagle and the mountain goat was suddenly replaced by the industrial fever of a civilization trying to conquer the clouds. The sound of the preparation was the rhythm of the explosion. To create a flat foundation on a vertical ridge, the mountain had to be dismantled. For months, the primary sound was the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of iron chisels driving holes into the limestone, followed by the muffled, deep boom of gunpowder. The air was thick with a permanent gray haze of pulverized rock,
a fine alkaline dust that coated the pine trees and turned the workmen into ghostly white-skinned figures. This was the sacrifice of the peak. Ludwig did not want a house built on the mountain. He wanted a house that was a continuation of the mountain. Every blast of powder was a rhythmic heartbeat of a new synthetic volcano, preparing the womb for the stone giant to be born. The foundation, the marriage of steel and silt. When the ridge was finally leveled, the rhythm of the foundation began. This was the most boring yet essential phase of the dream. Because the castle was to be built on such a precarious edge, the foundation had to be a masterpiece of invisible stability. The workmen poured tons of concrete and laid massive blocks of granite into the wounds of the mountain. The sound was the constant rhythmic creaking of heavy wooden cranes and the slop-slap of wet mortar. The atmosphere was one of geological patience. Ludwig would often visit the site at night, standing on the edge of the flattened ridge, looking down into the black void of the gorge. He felt the cold radiance of the newly laid stones. He was not looking for a home yet. He was looking for a weight. He wanted to feel the earth being anchored, to know that his dream was no longer floating in the mists of music, but was now locked into the granite. The foundation was the solid vow of the Moon King, a promise that he would never return to the horizontal world of the city. The rhythmic ascent, the dance of the masons. As the walls began to rise, the sound of the construction site settled into a predictable, meditative cadence. This was the era of the stone singer. Hundreds of masons from all over Europe converged on the ridge, creating a Babel of industry. The air was filled with the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of smaller hammers finishing the edges of the white limestone blocks. The movement of the materials was a study in mechanical rhythm. Because there was no road to the top, a complex system of steam-powered winches and pulley systems was devised. To describe this is to focus on the tension of the cable. The sound was the rhythmic thrum-whir of the steel ropes as they pulled the heavy blocks up from the valley floor. The blocks arrived like slow-motion visitors from the earth below, rising through the mist to take their place in the sky. Ludwig insisted on a specific visual frequency for the stones. They had to be white, so white they looked like frozen clouds. The atmosphere on the scaffolding was one of vertical peril, where men worked suspended over the abyss, their lives governed by the rhythmic heave-ho of the labor and the ticking of the king's clock. The tectonic sigh, the settling of the bulk. By the time the gateway building was completed, the castle had achieved its first structural breadth. The bulk of the gatehouse was made of red brick, a warm, earthy contrast to the white limestone that would follow. The sound of the site changed as the walls grew higher. The wind, which used to whistle freely over the ridge, now began to sing through the arches. This was the first sigh of Neuschwanstein. The building was beginning to create its own climate. The atmosphere inside the emerging halls was one of damp, cold expectation. The smell was a mixture of drying lime, fresh timber, and the metallic scent of the iron supports. Ludwig would sometimes walk through the half-finished rooms, his boots crunching on the stone shavings. He was not looking at the bricks, he was looking at the volume of the silence. He was measuring the space to see if it was large enough to hold the Wagnerian echo. Each stone was a syllable of a prayer, and as the walls rose, the prayer was becoming a granite shout directed at the heavens. the mechanical heart, the steam and the stone. A peculiar contradiction of the first stone was the presence of modern rhythms in a medieval dream. To build a fairy tale, Ludwig used the iron heart of the Industrial Revolution. The construction site was powered by steam engines that hissed and pulsed with a rhythmic heat. The sound of the steam, a constant hiss-thump, provided a mechanical counterpoint to the manual strike of the chisel. This was the boring paradox of the king's life. To escape the machine age, he had to become the master of machines. The atmosphere was a strange blend of medieval craft and modern torque. The winches that lifted the limestone were the same technology used in the coal mines and factories he despised. But here, the rhythm of the piston was being used to create a sanctuary of the spirit. The steam was the exhalation of the dream, the energy required to lift the heavy weight of reality into the light of the moon. The final foundation, the closing of the gateway. When the first section of the castle was completed, Ludwig moved in, not to a palace, but to a construction site of the soul. He lived in the gateway building, surrounded by the ongoing rhythmic clatter of the rising towers. The sound of the hammers was his lullaby. It was the proof that his dream was growing, stone by stone, day by day. He looked out from the high windows of the gatehouse at the shattered ridge and saw the future. The first stone had been laid, the mountain had been broken and remade, and the infinite loom had successfully translated the music of Wagner into the weight of the Alps. The Moon King had finally anchored his soul. The atmosphere was one of triumphant solitude. He was no longer a king of Bavaria. He was the master of the stone. And as the sun set over the Palat Gorge, the rhythmic sound of the last hammer strike of the day signaled that the dream was now permanent, cold, and divine. The Sculptor's Breath. A deep dive into the tactile world of the craftsmen, woodcarvers, painters, and stonemasons. As the exterior of Neuschwanstein rose like a granite exhalation from the Palat Gorge, the rhythmic violence of the explosions and winches gave way to a different kind of labor. The focus shifted from the tectonic scale to the somatic scale. This was the era of the sculptor's breath, a period where the castle's internal soul was carved stroke by stroke into the grain of the wood and the pigment of the plaster. To understand this phase of the dream is to inhabit the acoustic intimacy of the workshop. The sound was no longer a roar, but a constant rhythmic scritch, scrape, tap, the sound of hundreds of artists breathing life into the Wagnerian echo. The oak and the iron, the rhythmic chisel. The heart of the castle's tactile reality was the woodcarver's studio. Ludwig demanded a level of detail that defied the industrial timelines of the 19th century. He did not want furniture, he wanted mythic anatomy. The atmosphere in the carving rooms was one of scented stillness. The air was thick with the sweet, dry perfume of oak, cedar, and larchwood, mixed with the sharp scent of linseed oil and beeswax. The sound was a masterpiece of manual cadence. Imagine 14 master woodcarvers sitting in a row, their heads bowed in a rhythmic devotion. Each man held a set of steel chisels, tapping them with small wooden mallets. Tap, tap, scrape. Tap, tap, scrape. This was the sound of the royal bedroom being born. A room so complex it would take nearly 5 years of continuous labor. The primary object of this labor was the king's bed, a Gothic forest made of oak. The carvings were so deep and intricate that they created a labyrinth of shadows within the wood. Ludwig would visit at night, running his fingers over the carved spires and the tiny wooden faces of saints and knights. He was looking for a tactile resonance. He wanted the wood to feel vibrational, as if the music of Wagner had been trapped within the fibers of the oak. This was the boring history of the millimeter, a decade where time was measured by the depth of a single shaving of wood. The pigment and the plaster, the rhythmic stroke. While the carvers worked in the shadows, the painters inhabited the luminous heights of the scaffolding. The walls of Neuschwanstein were not merely painted, they were illuminated. The atmosphere was one of chemical alchemy. The painters mixed their own pigments, lapis lazuli for the deep blues, cinnabar for the reds, and real gold leaf for the celestial highlights. The sound was the soft, rhythmic hiss of the brush against wet plaster. This was the fresco rhythm, a race against the drying lime. The artists had to work with a synchronized velocity, laying down the colors of the Tannhauser legend or the Lohengrin saga before the wall became silent stone. Ludwig was a visual perfectionist. He would climb the scaffolding in the middle of the night, holding a lantern to the wet paint. He sought a specific atmospheric depth. He wanted the eyes of the painted knights to follow him with a static intelligence. The walls were not meant to be looked at, they were meant to be felt. The rhythm of the stroke had to match the rhythm of the song. Every leaf on a painted tree, every link in a painted mailcoat was a rhythmic repetition that served the total work of art. The painters were the weavers of the skin of the castle, turning the cold limestone into a warm, narrative membrane. The silk and the loom, the rhythmic thread. Deep within the workshops of Munich and Paris, another rhythm was supporting the king's dream, the rhythm of the loom. The curtains, the tapestries, and the throne room carpets were being woven with a dense, material silence. The atmosphere was one of fibrous concentration. The sound was the rhythmic clack, whir, thud of the hand looms. Ludwig demanded fabrics that felt heavy with history. He wanted silks that moved like water and velvets that swallowed the light. The boring history of the thread involved thousands of miles of gold-wrapped wire and silk dyed in the blue of the moon. When the textiles arrived at the castle, they changed the acoustic profile of the rooms. The stone echo was suddenly muffled by a fabric hush. The atmosphere became saturated. The curtains did not just hang, they guarded the windows, creating a rhythmic layering of light and shadow. To touch the embroidery was to feel the calculated friction of 1,000 hours of needlework. The castle was being dressed in a royal armor of silk, a soft barrier between the king and the cold reality of the mountain air. The marble and the mosaic, the rhythmic placement. In the throne room, the labor shifted to the mineral mosaic. Ludwig envisioned a floor that was a map of the cosmos. To describe its creation is to focus on the rhythm of the fragment. Millions of tiny pieces of marble, porphyry, and lapis lazuli had to be placed one by one into a bed of mortar. The sound was the rhythmic click-clack of stone meeting stone. The atmosphere was one of geometric prayer. The workmen spent months on their knees, their eyes inches from the floor, creating an orrery of stone. The floor depicted the animals of the earth, the plants of the sea, and the stars of the heavens, all arranged in a rhythmic spiral that led toward the empty space where the throne would have stood. Ludwig wanted a floor that felt infinite. He wanted to walk on the stars. The boring history of the mosaic was a study in human persistence. Each tiny stone was a pixel of myth. When the light from the massive gilded chandelier, shaped like a Byzantine crown, hit the floor, the millions of fragments would vibrate with a static radiance. The room was no longer a physical space. It was a rhythmic idea of the universe, anchored in the cold weight of the marble. The iron and the flame, the rhythmic forge. Beneath the artistic layers lay the rhythm of the iron. The castle was a hybrid of eras, and nowhere was this more evident than in the blacksmith's forge. The sound was the rhythmic clang, ring, clang of the hammer against the anvil. The atmosphere was of heat and shadow. The blacksmiths were crafting the skeletal grace of the castle, the ornate door hinges, the massive chandeliers, and the intricate window lattices. Ludwig wanted the iron to look like black lace. He wanted the metal to have the same fluid rhythm as the wood and the paint. The boring history of the forge was the rhythm of the temper. The iron was heated until it glowed with a sullen orange, then hammered into the shape of dragons, swans, and lilies. The sound of the cooling iron, the rhythmic hiss-sigh as it was plunged into the water, was the final exhalation of the craft. This iron was the sinew of the dream, providing the structural strength that allowed the delicate carvings and paintings to exist on the edge of the abyss. The final breath, the marriage of the crafts. By the early 1880s, the sculptor's breath had filled the lower and middle floors of the castle. The infinite loom had successfully integrated the wood, the paint, the silk, the stone, and the iron into a seamless reality. The atmosphere was of saturated silence. The castle was no longer a construction site. It was a living instrument waiting for its player. Ludwig would walk through the completed rooms, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, his eyes reflecting the gold leaf on the ceilings. He felt the tactile completion of his soul. Every rhythmic stroke of the chisel and every rhythmic placement of a mosaic stone had been a step toward the night. The boring history of the craftsman was the true foundation of the fairy tale. They had given the king's music a body of oak and a skin of pigment. As the sun set over the Alps, casting long rhythmic shadows through the Gothic lace of the windows, the Moon King realized that his dream was no longer a thought. It was a breath, held forever in the silent, carved grain of the mountain's heart. The blue grotto, the artificial cave, and the hypnotic, mechanical glow of early electricity. As the sculptor's breath filled the royal apartments with the organic warmth of oak and silk, King Ludwig II turned his attention to a space that defied the logic of both architecture and nature. Between the study and the living room of the third floor, he commanded the creation of the Venus Grotto. This was not a room, but a geological fiction, an artificial cave inspired by the Tannhauser legend. To understand the grotto is to enter the most surreal chapter of the boring history of Neuschwanstein. Here, the infinite loom ceased to weave threads of fabric and began to weave threads of electric light and stone mist. The crafting of the hollow, the iron skeleton. The creation of the grotto was a masterpiece of industrial deception. It was not carved from the mountain's natural hollows. It was built from the inside out, using a loom of iron. To describe its construction is to listen to the rhythm of the wire. Workmen erected a complex, jagged skeleton of iron mesh and steel rods against the inner brick walls of the castle. The sound was the rhythmic twist, snip, twist of pliers and the clattering of metal against metal. This iron cage was then draped with canvas and plaster, a mixture of hemp, hair, and cement designed to mimic the porous, irregular texture of a limestone cave. The atmosphere was one of gray, dusty confinement. The workmen moved through the narrow space like miners, their torches casting long, flickering shadows on the wet, gray skin of the cave. This was the boring history of the artificial, a meticulous process of making the manufactured look primordial. Every stalactite was a carefully calculated drop of plaster, hanging from the iron ribs like a frozen tear. The electric pulse, the birth of the glow. The true miracle of the grotto lay in its mechanical vitality. Ludwig wanted a cave that could change its atmospheric color to match the moods of Wagnerian music. To achieve this, he turned to the cutting edge of 19th century science. The grotto was one of the first spaces in the world to be lit by large-scale electricity. The sound was the constant low-frequency hum of the generators housed in a separate building nearby. This mechanical heartbeat was the rhythmic foundation of the fantasy. Behind the plaster walls of the cave, 24 arc lamps were arranged, filtered through rotating glass discs of different colors: red, blue, pink, and gold. When the switches were thrown, the cave did not just light up, it breathed color. The sound was the rhythmic click-whir of the glass plates turning in front of the lamps. The blue grotto was a static symphony. The light reflected off the artificial stalactites, creating a strobe-like effect that made the solid walls appear to undulate like water. This was the electric dream of the Moon King, a world where the vibrations of technology were used to serve the vibrations of myth. The aqueous mirror, the rhythmic drift. At the center of the grotto was a small artificial lake, fed by a rhythmic pulse of water pumped through hidden iron pipes. The sound was the soft, constant drip-plash of a waterfall that tumbled down the back wall of the cave. The atmosphere was one of humid immersion. The air was cool and thick with the scent of damp cement and ozone from the arc lamps. Ludwig would sit in his golden shell boat, a vessel shaped like a giant, iridescent mollusk. To describe his movements is to focus on the rhythm of the drift. He did not row, he let the gentle, circular current of the water carry him in a slow, hypnotic orbit around the cave. The sound of the water lapping against the golden hull, slap, swirl, slap, was his metronome. In this space, the king was no longer a monarch, he was a subterranean ghost. The blue light turned his skin into the color of moonlight, and the rhythmic mechanical rainbow overhead made the cave feel like it was located in a different dimension. He was seeking the stillness of the void. The boring history of the grotto was the history of a man trying to disappear into a luminous hole in the earth, powered by the very steam and coal he sought to escape. The tactile illusion, the texture of the unreal. The genius of the grotto was in its tactile fidelity. Ludwig insisted that the artificial stone feel old and cold. He had the painters apply layers of ochre and moss-green pigment to simulate the growth of ancient lichens. The sound of the grotto was acoustically deadened. Unlike the singing halls of the upper floors, the cave was designed to swallow sound. The irregular surfaces of the plaster walls absorbed every echo, creating a heavy silence that felt like being buried alive in a dream. Ludwig would run his hand over the artificial stalagmites, feeling the cold grit of the cement. He found comfort in the unchanging geometry of the space. Outside, the seasons changed. The Alpine snow melted. The summer sun scorched the valley. But inside the grotto, it was always the same electric twilight. The rhythm of the eternal was maintained by the rhythmic maintenance of the generators and the constant mechanical drip of the waterfall. It was a synthesized eternity, a piece of the world that had been frozen by the will of the king.
The mechanical rainbow, the frequency of color. One of the most elaborate features of the grotto was the color sequence. Ludwig had devised a rhythmic schedule for the lighting. The cave would start in a deep indigo, representing the depths of the Rhine, then transition through a rosy dawn of pink and violet, finally ending in a golden radiance that mimicked the interior of a sun. The sound was the rhythmic snap of the electrical relays and the clinking of the hot glass filters as they were rotated by hand. The atmosphere was one of chronological distortion. In the grotto, 10 minutes could contain the entire rhythm of a day. Ludwig was obsessed with the frequency of the light. He believed that different colors had different vibrational powers. The blue light calmed his heavy crown, while the red light stimulated his Wagnerian echo. The boring history of the grotto was a study in chromotherapy, the king using the rhythmic pulse of the spectrum to regulate his own turbulent spirit. The final submersion, the exit from the cave. The movement concludes with the closing of the grotto door. When Ludwig stepped out of the cave and back into the oak-paneled study, the world felt dull and linear. The grotto was his internal reservoir. The atmosphere of the castle changed after the grotto was completed. It was no longer just a palace, it was an experimental laboratory of the soul. The infinite loom had successfully integrated the steam age pulse with the medieval myth. The rhythmic hum of the generators beneath the floorboards was the new lullaby of the castle. As the Moon King retired for the day, waking at dusk as was his custom, the grotto remained in the dark, its iron skeleton holding the plaster cave in a static embrace. The boring history of the Blue Grotto was the proof that the king had found a way to build the night inside the very heart of the mountain. He had created a space where the rhythm of the machine served the silence of the dream, and for a few hours every night he was the only living thing in a world made of electric mist and plaster stone. The Throne Room of Air. A guided tour of the Byzantine-inspired halls where no throne was ever placed. As the Blue Grotto provided the king with a subterranean womb of electric mist, the throne room was designed to be its celestial opposite. It was to be the vertical apex of Neuschwanstein, a space that bridged the gap between the jagged limestone of the Alps and the shimmering gold of the heavens. To enter this hall is to witness the rhythm of the divine geometry. Here, the infinite loom transitioned from the dark oak of the German sagas to the blinding brilliance of the Byzantine Empire. It was a room conceived as a cathedral of sovereignty, yet it remains the most haunting part of the boring history of the castle. For in this room of gold and marble, the central object of power, the throne itself, was never installed.
It remains a throne room of air, a sanctuary built for a king who was already beginning to vanish. The architecture of the sacred, the Byzantine pulse. The throne room was not modeled after the medieval fortresses of the north, but after the Hagia Sophia and the royal chapels of Constantinople. Ludwig wanted a space that felt ancient and eternal. The atmosphere was one of saturated radiance. The air was not filled with the scent of pine or beeswax, but with the metallic ozonation of gold leaf and the cool, dry breath of white Carrara marble. The sound of the room was the rhythm of the echo. Because of its massive two-story height and its domed ceiling, every sound was amplified into a long, lingering vibration. To walk across the floor was to trigger a series of rhythmic thud echoes that traveled up the golden walls and bounced off the ceiling. This was the architecture of accountability. In this room, one could not whisper. Every breath became a public event. Ludwig designed the room to be a resonance chamber for the spirit. He wanted the rhythm of the architecture to force the body into a state of prostration. The two rows of pillars, the lower made of imitation red porphyry and the upper of imitation lapis lazuli, created a vertical cadence that drew the eye upward toward the dome. This was the boring history of the column, a meticulous arrangement of stone and color designed to simulate the order of the cosmos. The floor of the world, the mineral map. At the base of this golden void lay the mosaic floor, a masterpiece of mineral concentration. As described previously, millions of tiny stones were laid in a rhythmic spiral. To look at the floor was to see the rhythm of the biological kingdom. The atmosphere at the floor level was one of intricate density. The sound was the rhythmic click-clack of the workmen's tools as they polished the marble surface to a mirror finish. The mosaic depicted the plants and animals of the earth in a circular flow, a static procession that led the viewer toward the apse. For Ludwig, walking on this floor was a ritual of dominion. He was not stepping on the earth, he was stepping on a calculated representation of the earth. The boring history of the mosaic was the history of capturing the wild. By turning the living world into a geometric pattern of stone, the king felt he could finally understand it. The rhythm of the animals, the leaping stag, the coiled serpent, was frozen into a mineral piece, providing a stable foundation for the divine light above. The crown of the void, the gilded chandelier. Suspending from the center of the dome was the crown chandelier, a massive circular structure made of gilded iron and colored glass. It was designed to resemble a Byzantine crown, but its true purpose was to be a rhythm of light. The sound of the chandelier was the low metallic groan of the iron chain as it settled into place. The atmosphere was one of artificial brilliance. The chandelier held 96 candles, and when they were lit, the entire room vibrated with a golden shimmer. The sound was the rhythmic crackle hiss of the burning wax. The chandelier was the sun of the room. It cast rhythmic geometric shadows across the mosaic floor, turning the hall into a loom of light. Ludwig would sit beneath it at night, watching the flickering flames reflect off the golden walls. He was looking for the frequency of the divine. He believed that the light, filtered through the colored glass jewels of the chandelier, could harmonize his soul with the celestial rhythm. It was a boring history of illumination, a decade spent calculating the exact angles of the gold leaf so that every candle flame would be multiplied 1,000 times. The empty apse, the rhythm of the absence. The most profound feature of the room was the apse, the semicircular space at the end of the hall where the throne was meant to sit. The walls of the apse were covered in frescoes of the 6 holy kings, a rhythmic alignment of historical figures who represented the divine right of rule. The atmosphere in the apse was one of awaiting presence. The sound was a magnified silence. Ludwig had ordered a throne made of ivory and gold, a rhythmic masterpiece of carving that would have anchored the room. But the throne was never finished. The king ran out of money, and more importantly, he ran out of time. The result is a throne room of air. The empty space where the throne should be has a rhythmic pressure of its own. It is a visible void. To look at the apse is to feel the rhythm of the unfinished. The infinite loom had prepared the stage, but the actor never arrived. This absence is the true soul of Neuschwanstein. It represents the discordant truth of Ludwig's life. He built a temple for a god that did not exist, and a throne for a king who did not want to be found. The apse remains a symphonic pause that never resolves. The cosmic dome, the starlit ceiling. Above the empty apse and the golden chandelier was the azure dome, painted with the stars and the constellations. This was the rhythmic ceiling of the universe. The atmosphere was one of infinite expansion. The sound was the whisper of the wind through the high arched windows that looked out over the Alps. Ludwig wanted the ceiling to be a window into the void. The stars were painted in a rhythmic scatter, mimicking the actual positions of the heavenly bodies. The boring history of the dome was the history of celestial mapping. Ludwig spent nights with his court astronomer, ensuring that the rhythm of the stars was accurately translated into the pigment. He wanted to look up and see the same steady pulse that he saw from the mountain peaks. The dome was the final boundary of the dream. It was the point where the stone of the castle met the light of the stars. In the throne room of air, the king found his vertical liberation. He was no longer bound by the gravity of Bavaria. He was a lunar sovereign, ruled by the rhythm of the galaxies. The final resonance, the Hall of Ghostly Kings. The movement concludes with the stillness of the gold. By 1886, the throne room was visually complete, but functionally dead. The infinite loom had woven a masterpiece of Byzantine light, but there was no one to rule it. The atmosphere was one of haunted perfection. Ludwig would walk through the room alone, his footsteps the only rhythmic intrusion in the golden silence. He felt the weight of the absence. The room was a monologue of power, a space where the king spoke to the ghosts of the past because the people of the present could not hear him. The boring history of the throne room is the realization that beauty, when pushed to its absolute limit, becomes a wall of silence. As the sun set, the golden walls would glow with a dying radiance, and the mosaic floor would darken into a sea of shadow. The Moon King would stand in the center of the hall, beneath the crown chandelier, and realize that he had successfully built a kingdom of the mind. The throne room of air was the final proof that his dream was not for this world. It was a symphonic exit, a golden door that led directly into the infinite silence of the stars. The midnight sleigh. The rhythmic jingle of bells through the snow as the king traveled in solitary darkness. As the golden echoes of the throne room of air settled into a static, museum-like silence, King Ludwig II found his true kingdom not within the walls of his castle, but in the rhythmic motion of flight. while the world of the 1880s was obsessed with the iron rails of the locomotive and the loud clattering progress of the industrial machine, the Moon King sought the antique velocity of the sleigh. To understand these journeys is to embrace the boring history of winter. It was a decade defined by the cold blue hours, where the only measurement of time was the distance between one snow-laden pine and the next. This was the midnight sleigh, a vessel of shadow designed to carry the king through the silent, frozen heart of his Alpine realm. The preparation of the vessel, the gilded swan. The sleigh itself was a masterpiece of kinetic art. It was not a practical vehicle for transportation, but a symphonic carriage for the night. The atmosphere of the royal stables before a journey was one of breathless cold. The air was filled with the sharp metallic scent of frozen iron and the warm earthy steam rising from the flanks of the 4 dark horses.
The sound was the rhythm of the harness. The leather straps were thick and supple, treated with oils to prevent them from snapping in the sub-zero temperatures. As the grooms worked, the sound was a series of rhythmic clicks and pulls, a mechanical preparation for a ritual of escape. The sleigh was gilded in gold, its runners shaped like the necks of swans, reflecting the torchlight in a muted orange glow. The primary sound, the one that would define the king's mental landscape for years, was the constant, high-pitched jingle of the bells. These were not random bells, they were tuned to a specific frequency. Ludwig wanted a sound that was crystal and pure, a rhythmic chime that would cut through the heavy, muffling silence of the snow. This was the music of the void, a sound that signaled to the sleeping villages below that the Moon King was passing through the sky of the earth. The atmosphere of the night, the blue-gray blur. When the sleigh finally pulled away from the castle gates, the atmosphere shifted into a state of high-speed solitude. The world became a burrow of blue. Under the light of a full moon, the Alpine snow does not look white, it looks like luminous indigo. The sound was the hypnotic crunch glide of the runners. This was the boring rhythm of the winter journey, a repetitive, sliding sound that acted as a sedative for the king's restless mind. The wind, whipped up by the speed of the horses, whistled through the Gothic lace of the sleigh's carvings, creating a natural flute effect. Ludwig would sit wrapped in mountain-weight furs, bearskins and heavy velvets that smelled of cedar and the cold. He was a stationary traveler. While the horses pulsed with life and the outriders held their torches aloft, the king remained perfectly still. He was looking for the point of absolute zero. He wanted to move so fast and so quietly that he would eventually break the surface of time. The boring history of the sleigh ride was the history of a man trying to outrun his own shadow, using the rhythmic friction of the snow to wear away the edges of his identity. The torchlight and the shadow, the rhythmic flicker. Because the king traveled in the solitary darkness, he required a retinue of fire. A small group of outriders rode ahead and behind, carrying long wooden torches soaked in pitch. The atmosphere was one of dynamic chiaroscuro. The world was a series of sudden revelations. One moment, a jagged limestone cliff would be illuminated in a violent orange glow, and the next it would vanish into the absolute black of the gorge. The sound was the rhythmic whoosh crackle of the fire as the wind caught the flames. The shadows cast by the torches were rhythmic giants.
They danced across the snow-covered pines, turning the forest into a moving gallery of ghosts. Ludwig watched these shadows with a static fascination. He felt that the shadows were more real than the trees themselves. In the torchlight, the world was simplified. There were no ministers, no deaths, no wars, only the binary rhythm of light and dark. The outriders moved with a synchronized grace, their horses' hooves hitting the frozen ground with a muffled, rhythmic thud, thud, thud that provided the bass note to the silver treble of the bells. The solitude of the pass, the altitude of silence. As the sleigh ascended the high mountain passes, the atmosphere became thin and crystalline. At these heights, the trees vanished, and the world was reduced to rock, ice, and sky. The sound changed. The crunch glide became sharper as the snow was drier and brittle. The outriders' torches seemed to burn with a brighter, whiter flame in the thin oxygen air. This was the rhythm of the thin air. The breathing of the horses became the most prominent sound, a heavy, rhythmic hiss-puff of steam that billowed out into the night like a mechanical exhalation. Ludwig felt a sense of vertical liberation. At the top of the pass, he would order the sleigh to stop. The sound of the bells would suddenly die into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. In that silence, the king would look up at the star chamber. He felt the rhythm of the universe, the slow, cold rotation of the galaxies. He was no longer a king of Bavaria. He was a sovereign of the heights. The boring history of these stops was the history of existential calibration. He was measuring his own smallness against the vastness of the Alps, finding a rhythmic peace in the realization that everything human was temporary, but the cold was eternal. The return to the stone, the rhythmic re-entry. The journey would always end just before dawn, as the sky began to turn from indigo to a pale, sickly gray. The sleigh would descend back toward Neuschwanstein. The atmosphere was one of exhausted completion. The sound of the bells now felt heavy and dull. The horses moved with a laborious rhythm, their coats covered in a fine layer of white frost. The outriders' torches were now dying embers, casting a faint, rhythmic smoke into the morning mist. The re-entry into the castle was a tactile shock. The warmth of the gateway building, the smell of the wood smoke from the kitchens, and the rhythmic clicking of the castle clocks felt like an intrusion. Ludwig would step out of the sleigh, his legs stiff from the cold, and walk back into his stone sanctuary. He had washed his soul in the night. The midnight sleigh was the only bridge between the heavy crown of the city and the light crown of the dream. Without these rhythmic journeys into the darkness, the king believed his mind would have shattered into 1,000 pieces long ago. The final jingle, the echo in the snow. The movement concludes with the image of the sleigh being pulled back into the dark stables. The infinite loom has finished its nocturnal pattern. The atmosphere is one of static memory. The snow outside the castle is marked with the rhythmic scars of the runners, two long, parallel lines that lead off into the infinite white. The sound is the last faint tinkle of a bell as a horse shakes its head in the stall. The boring history of the midnight sleigh is the realization that the king's greatest travels were circuits of the soul. He was moving at high speed, but he was always returning to the same center of silence. As the sun finally rose over the Souling Mountain, the Moon King would close his heavy velvet curtains, the rhythm of the night still vibrating in his ears. he would fall into a deep blue sleep, dreaming of a world where the snow never melted and the bells never stopped their silver, rhythmic chime. The mirror of Lake Starnberg, the cooling of the dream, and the heavy, misty silence of the final days. As the midnight sleigh returned for the final time to the gates of the mountain, a new and darker rhythm began to settle over the life of King Ludwig II. The infinite loom of his existence, which had once woven vibrant tapestries of Wagnerian gold and Alpine white, now began to pull threads of deep indigo and ash. This was the cooling of the dream, a period where the architectural fire of Neuschwanstein was dampened by the rising mists of Lake Starnberg. To understand this penultimate movement is to enter the acoustic density of the fog. The sound was no longer the strike of a mason's hammer or the jingle of silver bells, but the muffled, heavy lapping of water against a shore that felt like the edge of the world. This was the boring history of the end, a slow-motion dissolution into the grey. The atmosphere of the siege, the rhythmic intrusion. By June 1886, the castle of Neuschwanstein had become a fortress of paranoia. The world outside, the Munich government, the bankers, and the psychiatrists was no longer a discordant noise in the distance. It was a rhythmic intrusion at the very gates. The atmosphere inside the castle was one of brittle suspension. The air smelled of cold stone and unburnt candles, a damp static that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains. The sound was the rhythm of the waiting. Ludwig stayed in the upper apartments, his footsteps a slow, repetitive thud creak on the parquet. Outside, the rain of the Polat Gorge fell with a sullen persistence, a grey curtain that hid the mountains he loved. The boring history of these days was the history of vertical confinement. The king would stand on the balcony, looking at the scaffolding that still clung to the unfinished towers like a skeletal cage. The sound of the waterfall below, the same waterfall that once sang the overture of Tannhäuser, now sounded like a constant, rushing erasure. He was being unmade by the very elements he had tried to master. The capture, the rhythm of the carriage. When the commission arrived to declare the king insane and remove him from his throne, the rhythm of the castle was shattered. This was the mechanical violation. The sound was the constant clatter-clash of heavy boots on the marble stairs, a sound that the architecture was never designed to hold. It was the sound of reality breaking into the dream. The atmosphere of the departure from Neuschwanstein was of profound displacement. Ludwig was led down the stairs he had carved with such care, his hand brushing the oak banisters for the last time. The sound was the slop-slop of the horses' hooves in the mud, and the rhythmic sobs of the local peasants who had gathered to watch his king be taken away. The carriage that took him to Schlossberg on the shores of Lake Starnberg was not a gilded sleigh, it was a closed box. The sound was the constant, monotonous droning of the wheels on the gravel road. Ludwig sat in the dark, his heavy crown now completely invisible, replaced by a heavy heart. He was moving away from the vertical solitude of the Alps and towards the horizontal stagnation of the lake. The infinite loom was now weaving a shroud of mist and reed. The lake, the rhythmic stagnation. Schlossberg was the antithesis of Neuschwanstein. Where the castle on the gorge was a granite shout, the house on the lake was a wooden whisper. The atmosphere was one of leaden humidity. Lake Starnberg in June is a world of grey on grey, where the water and the sky merge at a horizon that feels like a wall of felt. The sound was the rhythm of the lake. Unlike the roaring waterfall or the rushing wind of the heights, the water at Starnberg moved with a slow, oily lapping. Lip-lap, lip-lap. It was a sound that didn't go anywhere. It merely circled the shore. Ludwig would spend hours looking out at the water, his breathing slowing to match the stagnant pulse of the lake. The boring history of these final hours was the history of sensory deprivation. The vibrant gold of the throne room was replaced by the dull brown of the lakeside trees. The electric mist of the grotto was replaced by the natural fog that rose from the water in the evening. Ludwig was being cooled. The architectural fire that had built the towers was being extinguished by the persistent damp of his new prison. The final walk, the rhythmic pacing. On the evening of June 13th, 1886, Ludwig went for a final walk with his physician, Dr. Gooden. This was the rhythm of the last vigil. The atmosphere was one of indigo suffocation. The sun had set, and the woods around the lake were filled with a saturated darkness that smelled of wet earth and rotting lilies. The sound was the rhythmic crunch-settle of two pairs of boots on the gravel path. They walked in a synchronized silence. Ludwig moved with a static deliberation, his mind perhaps already submerged in the water he was walking beside. The infinite loom had reached the final inch of the thread. As they approached the water's edge, the sound of the lake became more prominent, a rhythmic gurgle through the reeds. This was the final lullaby. The king, who had sought the pure silence of the stars, now sought the absolute silence of the depths. The boring history of the walk was the transition from the vertical dream of the mountain to the liquid reality of the lake. The Moon King was ready to mirror himself in the dark glass of Starnberg. The submersion, the rhythm of the void. The exact events of what happened in the water remain a discordant mystery, but the atmospheric result was final. The sound was a brief, chaotic splashing, followed by a heavy, rippling silence. The lake accepted the dream without a sound. The atmosphere of the search that followed was one of frantic futility. Torches moved along the shore, their orange light flickering rhythmically over the dark water. The sound was the rhythmic calling of names that went unanswered. When the king's body was finally found floating in the shallow water, the rhythm of his life had officially stopped. He was found in a position of repose, his face looking up toward the hidden stars behind the clouds. The infinite loom had snapped. The boring history of Ludwig II ended not with a shout, but with a cold, wet sigh. The dream of Neuschwanstein had been cooled to the temperature of the lake. The king had finally found the vertical exit he had been looking for, but instead of climbing into the sky, he had sunk into the mirror. The final mirror, the stillness of the surface. The movement concludes with the absolute stillness of Lake Starnberg the following morning. The mist has cleared, and the water is as flat as a sheet of polished steel. The atmosphere is one of static completion. The castle of Neuschwanstein, hundreds of miles away, stands frozen and empty, a granite ghost watching over a gorge that no longer has a master. The sound is the first rhythmic chirp of a morning bird, a sound that signals the beginning of a world without the Moon King. The mirror of Lake Starnberg is the realization that the king didn't die, he simply became the architecture. His soul which could no longer inhabit a body of flesh, had finally taken up permanent residence in the stone and the mist. As the ripples on the lake died away, the infinite loom began a new, eternal pattern, one that would keep the name of Ludwig II and the towers of Neuschwanstein vibrating in the memory of the world. The eternal monument. The transition from private refuge to silent watcher of the ages, and its rhythmic life as a dream for the world. With the cooling of the dream in the dark mirrors of Lake Starnberg, the story of Ludwig II didn't end, it merely shifted its vibrational state. The infinite loom had finished weaving the life of the man, but it now began the far more monumental task of weaving the life of the myth. Neuschwanstein, once a private refuge designed for a single soul, was suddenly thrust into the rhythmic exposure of the public gaze. To understand this final movement is to witness the evolution of the silence. The castle transitioned from a secret prayer in stone to a universal monument of longing. This is the boring history of the immortal, a century-long process of the mountain reclaiming its king and the world reclaiming its dreams.
The opening of the gates, the rhythmic intrusion of the public. Only 7 weeks after the Moon King's death, the gates that were meant to keep the world at bay were swung open for a fee. This was the first discordant rhythm of the castle's new life. The atmosphere shifted from sacred seclusion to curious observation. The air, which had held the scent of solitary candles and Wagnerian scores, was now filled with the common breath of the masses. The sound was the rhythm of the footfall. Instead of the slow, deliberate pacing of a single man, the halls now echoed with the synchronized clatter of thousands of boots. To the castle, this was a rhythmic violation. The floors of the throne room, designed for the quiet vigil of a monarch, now vibrated with the persistent hum of the curious. The boring history of the early tourism era was the history of the erosion of mystery. Every ticket sold was a rhythmic tick on the clock of the castle's new reality. It was no longer a home, it was a spectacle. Yet strangely, the architecture held its ground. The high, narrow windows and the jagged white towers seemed to look over the heads of the crowds, still searching for the lunar sovereign who would never return. The silent watcher, the rhythm of the seasons. As the decades passed and the political world of Bavaria crumbled into the wars and revolutions of the 20th century, Neuschwanstein settled into its role as a static sentinel. While empires fell and borders were redrawn, the castle maintained its tectonic rhythm. The atmosphere was one of geological indifference. The sound was the rhythm of the Alpine cycle. In the winter, the castle returned to its natural state of silence. The snow fell with a muffled persistence, covering the scaffolding and the stone in a uniform white. The sound was the rhythmic crack of freezing limestone and the low vibrating roar through the towers. In the summer, the rhythm of the Thor brought the silver chime of the Polat waterfall back to life. The boring history of the mid-20th century was the history of survival through stillness. The castle was too high to be bothered by the frantic pulse of the machine age. It remained a vertical anachronism. It became a mirror for the world's guilt, a reminder of a time when beauty was pursued with a fanatical devotion that the modern world had long since abandoned. The architecture became a rhythmic anchor, a fixed point in a world that was moving too fast. The global icon, the rhythm of the lens.
In the latter half of the century, Neuschwanstein underwent a visual transformation. Through the medium of film and photography, the castle's rhythm was broadcast to every corner of the planet. It became the blueprint for the fairy tale. The atmosphere was one of technological multiplication. The sound was the rhythmic click of the shutter. Millions of cameras focused on the white turrets, capturing the ideal frequency of the dream. The castle was no longer just a building in Bavaria. It was a global archetype. It represented the rhythm of the human imagination, the universal desire to build a sanctuary above the clouds. The castle was flattened into a postcard, a logo, and a cinematic backdrop. Yet the actual stone remained stubbornly three-dimensional. No matter how many times it was photographed, the tactile truth of the castle could only be understood by standing in its shadow. The infinite loom had successfully woven the castle into the collective consciousness of humanity. It became the silent watcher of the world's fantasies, a place where the heavy crown of modern life could be momentarily laid aside for the light crown of the imagination. The modern pilgrimage, the rhythmic pulse of the multitude. Today, Neuschwanstein exists in a state of saturated rhythmic intensity. Every year, millions of people make the vertical journey up the mountain path. The atmosphere is one of hectic reverence. The air is a mixture of Alpine oxygen and the electrical energy of 1 million smartphones. The sound is a polyphonic clatter. It is the rhythmic clop-clop of the horse-drawn carriages that still carry visitors up the hill, a residual echo of the midnight sleigh. It is the rhythmic drone of the multilingual guides, telling the story of the Moon King in 1,000 different cadences. But deep within the stone heart of the castle, the original silence still remains. In the quiet moments after the last tourist has left and the gates are locked for the night, the atmosphere returns to its lunar frequency. The sound is the rhythmic settled creak of the old oak and the cold limestone. The boring history of the present is the history of maintenance and preservation. The masons still tap at the stones, the painters still touch up the frescoes, and the infinite loom continues to weave the thread of the dream, ensuring that the castle remains permanently unfinished and forever eternal. The cosmic echo, the rhythm of the unreachable. As the sun sets over the soiling and the moon rises to claim the white towers once more, Neuschwanstein achieves its final rhythmic resolution. It is the throne room of the universe. The atmosphere is one of stellar communion. The sound is the music of the spheres. It is the low-frequency vibration of the mountain itself, merging with the high-frequency shimmer of the stars. The castle is a loom of the infinite, a structure that bridges the gap between the boring reality of the earth and the symphonic mystery of the heavens. The Moon King's dream was not a flight from life, but a flight toward truth. He built a place where the rhythm of the soul could finally match the rhythm of the divine. Neuschwanstein is the eternal monument to that pursuit. It stands as a static shout in the silence of history, a reminder that as long as there are mountains and as long as there is moonlight, there will be a need for a vertical sanctuary. The infinite loom has finished the story, but the echo of the stone will continue to vibrate through the ages, a silent watcher of the dreams that keep the world alive.
That is where the true spirit of the Moon King's dream, the architectural solitude of Neuschwanstein Castle, rests. Not in grand feasts or legends, but in the quiet grace of gratitude itself.
And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Have a great night.